Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for the ninth panel in the sixth year of the Transitional Justice in the USA Speaker Series. I'm Lisa LaPlante. I direct the Center for International Law and Policy. We're at New England Law Boston, where I'm also a professor of law. So to give a bit of background, in collaboration with some 40 institutions nationwide, we launched the speaker series in 2020 to explore how transitional justice can illuminate current efforts in the US to address historical and current racial injustice and violence. Our shared goal has been to elevate national attention to this broader justice movement and to offer a global lens for understanding how it fits within similar struggles that play out around the world. And across these conversations, and I welcome all of you to visit the homepage of the series, which we'll be posting in the chat, we've seen clear points of connection between the pursuit of racial justice in the US and the experiences of other marginalized communities globally as part of transitional justice processes. And now more than ever, these kinds of sustained exchanges are essential. So today's panel is entitled Reimagining Repair, the Role of DEI in Racial Redress and Institutional Reform. And our wonderful speakers will explore whether understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion through transitional justice can shift current debates about its legitimacy and purpose, how it functions as a remedial mechanism rooted in longstanding attempts to redress racial discrimination, as well as a vehicle for institutional transformation to guard against future harms. Additionally, they'll unpack some of the current political rhetoric and policy aimed to undermine DEI, to understand its causes and impacts, including renewed harms. And they will end with looking at the future to ask what legal, cultural, and educational steps might be needed to sustain DEI work to support an inclusive, rights-respecting society. Okay, so I want to thank our co-organizers of this event, in particular, Nicole Dishlewski, Assistant Dean for Curricular Innovation and Professor at Roger Williams University School of Law, and Erica George, Associate Dean for Equity, Justice, and Engagement, in addition to serving as a professor of law at Boston University School of Law. Both of them will facilitate today's panel. And I also want to express my appreciation for all the co-sponsors of this series who helped make this an inclusive and far-reaching conversation. So I want to give a few logistics before we get started. During the discussion, you're welcome to post in the Q&A. We will hold those questions for the end of the discussion with the panelists. You can find their full bibliographies on our homepage, which will be posted in the chat, so we won't be providing that information to save time for the conversation. And again, you can find the recording of this on that homepage if for some reason you missed the registration window. I just also wanted to announce that I'm thrilled to announce the first Transitional Justice in the USA trends report that our project just published yesterday. And so you have a link in the chat. It is tracking the development of 96 truth and reparation initiatives in the US since 2020. So happy to share all of that important work done by students of this project along with me and SILP. So we'll also be posting other resources and books by our panelists as well. So with that, I'm happy to hand the mic to Nicole and Erica to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Before we begin, I want to start by reading the land and labor acknowledgement of my home institution. Let's take a moment to reflect on the lands on which we reside. The Roger Williams University School of Law's campuses are located on the ancestral and traditional lands of Indigenous people. Together, we honor and acknowledge the Narragansett and Pokanoket nations as the original stewards of this land who lived, governed, and cared for it long before the arrival of European settlers. We also recognize that the foundation of this country was built through the forced labor of enslaved African people. The town of Bristol, including the land upon which our campus stands, was significantly shaped and enriched by the transatlantic slave trade. We acknowledge this painful history and its enduring legacy, and we honor the resilience, knowledge, and cultural contributions of the African diaspora whose labor was exploited through systems of violence and white supremacy. As we start this today, and I turn this over to my co-moderator, Erica, I want to start with a deep breath and an acknowledgement that you might not be okay. I am not okay. Other panelists are feeling the feels about things going on in the news, things going on in our classrooms, things going on in our institutions. We are not okay. And I wanted to say it is okay that you're not okay, and to thank you for being here with us today. And thank you for being here in community. And I'll turn it over to Erica.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Thank you very much, Lisa. And thank you to all who've made this possible. It's an extraordinary opportunity for us to come together and to learn together, and to lead together. I will take my brief time to give an overview of the general questions that our speakers will be considering. How should we consider the relationship between DEI initiatives and broader efforts to remedy historic racial discrimination and other forms of discrimination? What are the core drivers behind the current political climate and political backlash and cultural disavowal of DEI and the risks that those may pose for marginalized or communities or even the rule of law? Um, what legal, cultural, and pedagogical teaching strategies are needed to sustain this very important DEI work and to protect the institutions with commitments to DEI in the landscape that has become much more fraught and terrain that's more difficult to travel without some kind of cross understanding of the importance and one that's historically grounded? And then in what ways do DEI frameworks echo the goals of transitional justice projects, such as truth-telling, redress, and institutional reform? So with those as our guidelines or guiding questions, I will turn back to Nicole, who will introduce. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Erica. So I'm going to give a very brief introduction, just reminding everybody that a full biography for the speakers is available at the link that was shared in the chat. Danielle Conway is the Dean of Penn State Dickinson Law and the School of International Affairs and the Donald J. Farage Professor of Law. She is the Executive Director of the Anti-Racist Development Institute, as well as the President of the American Association of Law Schools. Anu Gupta is the award-winning author of Breaking Bias, keynote speaker, lawyer, educator, entrepreneur, and founder and CEO of Be More with Anu. Marie Wilson served as one of 3 commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, following decades of experience as an award-winning journalist, trainer, and senior executive manager. She is also an author with the 2024 release of North of Nowhere, Song of a Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner, a memoir of her days with the TRC. Last but not least, and someone I prefer to introduce themselves, is Tayano Palermo, who is a colleague of mine, an educator, an advocate, an attorney, and co-founder and co-director of the Center for Indigenous Peoples' Rights, the East Coast's first and only pro bono law and policy center focused on the rights of Indigenous peoples. We are going to kick this off with some words from Ty. So Ty, I turn it to you.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you for having me on this panel. I just want to start with one of the things that I'm excited about this discussion and the work that we do at the Center for Indigenous Peoples' Rights is we had the honor and pleasure of negotiating on behalf of the Pokanoket, who you heard in the land acknowledgement, with Brown University for the return of 250 acres of land that is the site of the seats of the Massasoit where the first Thanksgiving occurred. And so this past Thanksgiving was the first time they've been back on their land for the first harvest since 1620 when the treaty was signed. So we take this kind of work seriously and are hands-on with it. And so I was honored to be a part of this panel. And in my part, I'm going to try and set us up for a kind of like a historical through line into where we are today. And so, you know, what we call diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, to folks who have been in this work for a very long time, you know that this is DEI in itself is not a new development. It's more so, you know, the most recent iteration of a much longer legal and institutional effort to respond to systems that were deliberately structured to exclude. And so to understand DEI, we have to start not with inclusion, but with the legal construction of exclusion. And from the earliest moments of U.S. law, we see doctrines that actively were structured based on who belonged and who didn't. Now, I teach federal Indian law at the Roger Williams Law School, as well as tribal courts and government. And so, in federal Indian law, and for my property law folks, cases like Johnson versus McIntosh in particular, and another case, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, which these two cases that are part of a three-part foundational cornerstone of federal Indian law known as the Marshall Trilogy. They formalize a system where indigenous people are recognized, but only in a very constrained and subordinate political status. And so they're placed outside the full constitutional community while still being governed by it. And so that creates this foundational dynamic at the, early part of this country's formation. And this inclusion for some groups is built alongside permanent marginalization for others. And so that dual structure is not incidental. It's embedded in the legal architecture of the United States. And that matters for DEI because, DEI inherits these institutions that were built on those exclusionary foundations. And so the first major attempt to reconstruct that system comes during Reconstruction. The 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments represent this effort to redefine membership in the political community, particularly through citizenship and equal protection. Probably unironically, as unfortunate as that may be, given the timing of this event and where we are, we saw this question come up as recent as last week in the Supreme Court case Trump versus Barbara, where the challenge to Trump's executive order ending birthright citizenship. Justice Gorsuch asked the Solicitor General if Native Americans are birthright citizens, and he said he'd have to think more about that. So, but nonetheless, these amendments, they were geared at overturning the Dred Scott case that said enslaved Africans are not, or formerly enslaved are not citizens, an attempt to establish this universal baseline of legal equality. But even here, the inclusion, is partial. And indigenous people are largely excluded from those that this constitutional reconstruction, and are instead incorporated through a later statute, and become naturalized as citizens. But from the outset, this idea that law can repair exclusion is introduced, but it's just unevenly applied. And so that unevenness becomes even clearer during the period of retrenchment after Reconstruction, that followed, because, formal legal recognition does not translate into meaningful institutional access. And so for Black communities, Jim Crow laws dismantled the promises of Reconstruction. And for Indigenous communities, federal policies of assimilation and control continue to reinforce structural exclusion, as evident as Indian boarding schools. You kill the Indian, save the man. This is a critical turning point, and it demonstrates that legal status alone is insufficient. And so you can have formal equality and still have deeply unequal institutions. And that sets the stage for the civil rights era. And here we begin to see something closer to, I think, what we would now recognize as like DEI-like mechanisms. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, do more than just declare rights. They impose, obligations on institutions. They require schools, employers, governments to actively, dismantle discriminatory practices. And then affirmative action goes a step further, or went a step further. Because that explicitly links historical harm to targeted institutional remedies. So this is no longer just about equal treatment, which is where the pushback to it comes from. And so, it's about corrective inclusion. Institutions are expected to account for these disparities. They didn't create them, but they continue to reproduce and perpetuate these disparities. And so that's the direct precursor to DEI. So the core idea is already there. So institutions bear this responsibility for addressing inequity within their own structures, while at the same time, there's this parallel development happening in federal Indian law that is also kind of left out of these conversations, one of the one of those kind of clear examples is the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, which is a different model of redress. And probably, as I tell my students, you're likely not to find another community or population of people within the United States who are treated in this way, for better or worse. But in this model of redress, rather than focusing on exclusion within existing systems that we most often, recognize as DEI, it shifts control over to the institutions themselves, from the institutions themselves to tribal governments. And that distinction is important because, DEI largely operates within existing institutional frameworks, whereas self-determination, this federal approach to tribes governing themselves, changes who governs these frameworks. And so it's a structural redress rather than an incorporative attempt to address inequities. And so, that still nonetheless highlights this, I think, a limitation DEI continues to carry. Hopefully we'll unpack more of that here. But it's working within systems that were not originally designed to be equitable. And so, by the late 20th century, we start to begin to see legal constraints on race conscious remedies, particularly through equal protection jurisprudence limiting affirmative action. And that's kind of what we're seeing lately. And so institutions adapt, fold, however you want to look at it, and they shift away from these explicit, and are shifting away from these explicit efforts of redress and language around DEI. And so DEI kind of emerged out of that context as trying to be like a more legally durable and institutionally manageable form of these earlier corrective efforts. But it retains key elements of the recognition of historical exclusion, the role of the institution's responsibility, a commitment to inclusion, but has been doing so in a way that's trying to fit within these tightening legal boundaries. So, when we ask how civil rights reforms and affirmative action evolve into DEI, the answer is, that DEI is not a break from those efforts. It is their translation under these constraints. And now we see the constraint becoming even tighter with, language, departments, administrators, the censoring of things. And so, this is, there were DEI-like mechanisms before the term existed, and there will nonetheless be mechanisms to address institutional inequities, whether you call it that or not. But civil rights, enforcement, affirmative action, school desegregation efforts, even certain aspects of tribal self-determination, they all reflect attempts by institutions to, respond to these historical harms. So I think what changes over time is not the underlying goal, but the legal and political space in which, those efforts operate. So I'll close with this. I think DEI is best understood not as a contemporary initiative, but as part of a longer trajectory of attempted redress. And that trajectory kind of begins with systems of exclusion rooted in colonization and slavery, moves through Reconstruction and civil rights as efforts at inclusion and correction, and then arrives at DEI as this constrained institutional response that's highly politicized. So, nonetheless, it remains incomplete. I mean, it doesn't fully engage with questions of sovereignty, land, structural redistribution of power. I think that's where, our panel's broader kind of framing around transitional justice is particularly useful and timely, because it allows us to kind of ask whether DEI is, the end point, or whether it's just simply a stage in a much longer and unfinished project of repair. So I will stop there.
Thanks so much, Ty. I just want to sort of think about and uplift some of what you said. I think a big takeaway, because he said it twice, is DEI is not new. I think we know that. I don't know how often people say it. I think another thing I want to uplift is that the legal and institutional structures were designed to exclude and then replicate that exclusion. And it is because of that we have this like legal and sometimes institutional permanent marginalization That is not in effect, it is a purpose that some of the DEI efforts have been an attempt to redefine membership in the political community. And I think that's sort of a good way to think about it, whether we're talking legally or institutionally. And you question how historically and how going forward can the law repair this exclusion? And then I think my biggest takeaway is there sort of wouldn't be the need to repair through DEI without exclusion. And there wouldn't be pushback to that repair if we didn't already have exercised our exclusionary muscles. And so this is not something incidental, this is something on purpose. And we should be talking about it and treating it that way. And so I really appreciate, really grounding us to the conversation going forward. And I am going to turn it over to Dean Daniel Conway.
Thank you so much for having me. Professor Ty, thank you for that grounding as well. I think what I would like to say is genealogically consistent with what Ty has put forward, and then focus that genealogical spectrum in a way that grounds us with indigenous practice of actually going back to fundamental principles. And so when we look at the fundamental principles of those Reconstruction amendments to respond to this perpetual, intentional, systemic exclusion, those Reconstruction amendments, particularly the 14th Amendment, was meant to restart society. And it was meant to restart society on a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial, and intersectional basis. There were so many conversations in all of the legislative history about this. People were arguing, people were in fisticuffs arguing about this, and we should recognize that because that's how important that restart was, that people were some angry, people were some sort of mad, people were some sort of, betrayed by this nation that when you looked at the Declaration of Independence was asking the very same thing of King George that many people were asking of this new nation. And so genealogically speaking, I want to double down on Professor Ty because this is where we need to situate acknowledgments. So part of the 14th Amendment, in my observation, and why it is so important and why it is so contested, is because it gives us the framework of anti-racism as yet another push in this genealogical spectrum. And that is the going back to the restart of this nation, the reboot of this nation, and what that 14th Amendment was meant to do. I think, unfortunately, like we've been talking about, the concepts of inclusion, affirmative action, diversity, equity, and inclusion, those concepts have been captured by those with power. And so when we think about the capturing of those, let's call them, conceptual ways of being, by capturing those in this framework of who has power, the folks who have power get to redefine what diversity, equity, and inclusion is, what affirmative action is. And they also get to define what they believe is wrong with it. And so this is why I do like to go back to the reboot and really ground any discussion in anti-racism, because that was the intentionality of those who fought, angry, upset, terribly vexed about the original sin of slavery in the context of what our founders were running from the British. So we need to, I think, have that as a grounding discussion as well. And say we know that aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion now in this genealogical spectrum have been captured. And so one of the things I'd like to add to this is how in corporate America we look at employee resource groups and how those are being challenged, when in fact those were captured by the corporation and meant to identify in a passive way that we are responding to this idea of inclusion. When we think about people of color, when we think about women, when we think about intersectional identities, this is our response. But then all of a sudden, because we have this conservative activism, now even those captured employee resource groups are somehow tainted. So I'll stop there in case there are follow-up questions, because I said a lot.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dean Conway. I want to try to weave together what Professor Palermo said and your intervention. And what strikes me about them both is reclaiming this moment and remembering Reconstruction, that there was a new founding or an effort at a new founding that would have taken us on the trajectory towards redress that we have fallen short of. And that is in large part due to capture of the concepts that were to reverse exclusion. These were legal means of moving towards a more inclusive, pluralistic, anti-racist society. There were the fraught founding debates that happened at that moment of Reconstruction, though we've not fully recalled it. And maybe there's much to be gained by reclaiming that history and making a fuller history. It is also not lost on us that the kinds of things that are being challenged or captured or censored are things like history. There are multiple humanities departments across the country that are under pressure. There has been the National Park Service removing the names of places from Medgar Evers's home to places in Pennsylvania. So we see an erasure of what was a move towards exclude. This comes down in many ways to thinking about equity as who gets membership. Trump versus Barbera was mentioned. So I think I understand this is an invitation to return to first fundamental principles of a reconstruction and a reboot and a restart that has been stalled sharply, in part because of the capture, but maybe the responsiveness of institution was not revolutionary, but evolutionary, and it was easier to derail because it hadn't quite gotten to take root in the way that perhaps a remedy or repair in a transitional sense would have warranted. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to now invite, I can't see you on the screen, Anu, to join us with his intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Danielle. Hi, everyone. My name is Anu Gupta, and it's an honor for me to be on this panel to speak about transitional justice and DEI, two fields that have deeply shaped my professional journey. My entry into these fields really began in law school, where I studied transitional justice, specifically examining how societies come out of a period of what scholars call radical evil, or systemic and widespread injustice, like Europe after the Holocaust, Rwanda after the genocide, and South Africa after apartheid. While I was deeply moved by these global examples, the whole time this was a year-long course, I couldn't shake this persistent feeling that we need this in the US. So after law school, I worked as an attorney focused on racial disparities in the criminal legal system. And pretty quickly, I ran into a hard truth that despite, having some of the most beautifully crafted anti-discrimination policies on the books, across life outcomes, whether it was housing, healthcare, education, or criminal justice, Black and brown people fared the worst. And this is because policies are fragile. They can be rewritten or dismantled, as we are seeing right now. But more importantly, policies do not account for how humans make decisions. The research on implicit bias has shown that racial disparities persist, not because people consciously intend harm, some do, but not all, but because of unconscious biases or learned habits of stereotyping that impacts their decision-making. To me, that realization made clear that we cannot create racial redress at the level of policy alone. We must also transform hearts and minds, which led me to found Be More with the New, where over the past 12 years, we've trained more than 100,000 professionals, doctors, lawyers, students, teachers, in tools to recognize and transform unconscious bias in decision making. At its core, my work is focused on three things: bridging the information gap, correcting misinformation, and repairing the empathy gap. So for us, DEI is not about compliance or branding, it's about truth-telling and building a shared understanding of reality so organizations and individuals can address and repair the systemic ways Black and Brown people are excluded and harmed. And this is where I've come to appreciate the limits of the law. As a lawyer, I was trained to believe that with the right argument or with the right policy, we would produce justice. But what we've witnessed, what we are witnessing, is that beneath our systems are stories. Stories about who belongs and who doesn't, who's really American and who isn't, and who's valued and who isn't. These stories really shape the decisions of our policymakers, our business leaders, and even voters every single day. Let me offer one concrete example. When I ask audiences, how old is the concept of race? I hear answers like 10,000 years, 5,000 years, maybe 500 years. Rarely have I seen a group of people agree. And that, to me, is striking because race is something that shapes every one of our lives. Yet many people, including doctors, judges, lawyers, and beyond, still believe that racial categories are biologically real. They are not. The modern concept of race as a hierarchy is less than 250 years old. It was constructed in the 18th century by European thinkers like Blumenbach, who attempted to classify and rank human beings based on color and geography by literally collecting and measuring human skulls. So what began as a set of flawed and biased ideas became embedded into law, into media, into education, and into our social interactions. And in many ways, we're still living in that flawed story today. So for me, when we talk about DEI, we're not simply talking about workplace initiatives. We're asking whether we're willing to re-examine the stories that organize our society. This is what DEI has been for me until the backlash against it really started gaining momentum in 2024. And tragically, the backlash has changed DEI from a forward-looking project of institutional repair, as Danielle and Taino mentioned, into a defensive project of legal survival. Specifically, DEI backlash has reshaped the day-to-day realities of equity work in 5 ways. First, the field has contracted significantly. Ever since the surge of DEI roles following George Floyd's murder in 2020, DEI jobs have now dropped by more than 60% from their peak, and 55% of human resources officers have scaled back or eliminated their DEI initiatives entirely. From Google to Target to the American Medical Association, these are just some examples of organizations that have dissolved their DEI teams. What this means is that many practitioners have lost their jobs. They've had their responsibilities narrowed, or they've been reassigned into less visible functions. And this is not abstract for me. In 2025 alone, we saw an 80% reduction in our work, and nearly half of our long-standing partners eliminated their DEI departments or budgets entirely. So when we talk about the backlash, we're also talking about livelihoods, about relationships, and years of work disappearing overnight. Second, the work has become more legally and politically constrained. Federal executive orders in 2025 and 2026, as late as March 26th, which was just a couple of weeks ago, have directed all federal agencies to dismantle DEI programs, and they've required all federal contractors to eliminate any initiatives that can be perceived as DEI. When it comes to higher education, in 2025 alone, 93 higher ed censorship bills were introduced in 32 states, and 21 became law. In addition, federal actions have made the work of DEI extremely difficult, particularly in higher education, as they've conditioned federal funding to the elimination of any program that could be perceived as DEI. Third, the work has been deprioritized. Many institutions that have not abandoned DEI have renamed it. to culture, to belonging, to engagement. And while some of that rebranding is strategic, it also reflects a deeper reality. The space for explicit truth-telling, which is the core of transitional justice, has narrowed. Fourth, the DEI backlash has disproportionately burdened economic and professional prospects of practitioners of color. Because DEI roles have been disproportionately held by people of color, the contraction of the field has translated into real losses of jobs, income, and long-term career prospects for those communities. And this is layered on top of pre-existing inequities. Research has long shown that people of color, particularly Black and Latina women, are underrepresented in leadership and receive less institutional support. Now, many are navigating heightened scrutiny, role instability, public criticism, in some cases, direct threats or harassment. And fifth and last, the backlash has reshaped how people understand the purpose of DEI. We've moved from asking, how do we create fairness and belonging, to asking, who is being fairly advantaged? And that shift is being driven by misinformation, incomplete narratives, and a widening empathy gap. Because when people don't understand history, when they don't know history, when they're fed distorted narratives and when they cannot see themselves in one another, lies, anger, denial fills the vacuum, making repair feel threatening. And that ultimately is the deepest cost of this moment. So what do practitioners need right now? Three things. First, we need support in reclaiming the narrative, moving beyond the caricature of DEI as unfair advantage and back towards its real purpose, building trust, cohesion, and a shared future. Second, we need visible and vocal support and truth-telling from political and business leadership, not just quiet endorsement, but public commitment. And third, we need this work to be integrated into how institutions actually function, from product development and service delivery to overall strategy. So when we look at the DEI backlash from the lens of transitional justice, for me, I see it as a problem of a contested transition. A contested transition in how we understand history, how we define belonging, and whether we're willing to repair. If DEI continues to be reduced to compliance or branding, it will not survive this moment. But if we understand it as a practice of collective repair, closing the information gap, correcting misinformation, and healing the empathy gap, then it becomes something much more resilient. Because ultimately, this work is not about us versus them. It's about fulfilling the promise at the heart of the American experiment, that every person has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It asks whether we can learn from both hindsight and foresight and turn that into insight, that race-based divisions are not fixed truths, but constructed stories. And if they're constructed, they can be transformed. But to do that, we must be willing to tell the truth of our shared history, of white supremacy, of African enslavement, of Jim Crow, of Juan Crow, of indigenous genocides, of AAPI, Middle Eastern and Latina exclusion, and of the erasure of European ethnic identities. We have to acknowledge it, we have to accept it, and we have to commit to the work of reconciling and repairing it so that we can finally lay to rest what has divided us and move toward a more fully realized democracy, one where everyone can belong and access opportunity in the fullness of their dignity. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And there is so much there. Anu has added a practitioner's perspective to what has so far been one that's rooted in the conversations we're having in the academy, and more specifically the legal academy. But law has impacted the space that you operate in. There were executive orders the first day of this administration attempting to eviscerate the important work being done to move to making real the Reconstruction imagined United States. So we've heard from you about ways in which our challenges have been rooted in concepts that were created to justify domination and exclusion, the racial construct concept, which I think people struggle with. Is race real? Is it not real? But what we make of it matters because that informs the stories that we tell that shape the societies and realities that we are able to walk through, some of us more easily than others. So critically important to, again, come back to that. And I think narrative and story and what's imagined has been a through line from what we've heard to date. But more specifically, because you are out in the world doing this work, and also Dean Conway does this work as well through the Anti-Racism Institute, but the backlash cost, what is the cost of the backlash, specifically to the communities doing the work? And I think in a derivative and direct way to those of us who would have benefited from the work that is now more difficult to do. The constriction of DEI jobs and initiatives, shocking statistics you shared, the political and legal constraints that seem to become more and more constraining and spreading across different states. This deprioritization, the discourse, changing terms, rebranding, but we need to move beyond brands and tell the truth of what it is we're trying to address. And then the disproportionate impact of these job losses falling disproportionately on members of BIPOC communities, on top of the past exclusion. And then how to understand DEI or the wide acceptance of this deliberately planted misinformation that DEI is unfairly advantaging some. I think I remember seeing the memes during Kamala Harris's running for the presidency, did not earn it, DEI, right? So far from being what was intended, something that's pushing forward, now there's a defensiveness around the work because it's been so defamed. But I love that you also offer us some ways forward, some solutions. I took from this that it's important for us to not be quiet. The quiet endorsements still happen. I think people might be doing quote unquote DEI on the down low, but what needs to happen, and it'd be restoratively consistent, to be public in our expressions of endorsement for pluralistic, equal societies, and that there needs to be really serious embedding of equity across institutions and structures, and that will remain a struggle. So getting there will require us to have some trust, some shared stories, and increased empathy. So you've invited us not to run the risk of treating this as compliance, but returning to understanding roots in something that's restorative and transitional. So I'm going to now turn to Marie and Nicole. Thank you, Anu, and thank you, everyone.
All right, Marie, we'd love to hear from you.
Well, good morning, everyone. And I just want to, am I unmuted? Can you hear me? Yes, thank you. I just want to appreciate the land acknowledgement as we began today. Thank you very much for that. I'm actually speaking to you from Northern Canada. I live in the Northwest Territories in a community called Yellowknife. So in your American context, think Alaska and look right over a couple of jurisdictions. I live and work and am married into the Dene Nation, which is one of the
Oh no.
You're back on mute somehow.
Sorry, I did not touch anything, so I don't know what happened there, but the warbles got in. Anyway, I don't want to take up all my time repeating, but just to say that I live on what is known here as Treaty 8 territory. It's part of the Dene Nation, wider homeland, relatives of the Navajo, and it has been my home for almost 50 years, though I am originally from southern Ontario, just across from the Michigan border. So I have a big experience of Canada in its many complex parts. I'm really happy to be here today, and I want to make plain that anything I say is my own information, but it was a shared experience in the commission, and I name and acknowledge our former chair, now the late Murray Sinclair, and my co-commissioner, Chief Wilton Littlechild, both of them lawyers, so in the field that many of you share. My background is as a journalist and as a a long time kind of social justice advocate in the public sphere. But what I wanted to talk about, because I've been asked to consider what might U.S. institutions draw from the Canadian experience or other. I can't speak cohesively about the whole Canadian experience, but I can tell you a little bit very particularly about our Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Many of the things that have already been said by my very esteemed fellow panelists touch on some of the things, if I may say, that I think we got right about how we did our work. But it also starts from what our mandate was and the very nature of our mandate, which gave us a lot of latitude to try to do things in a good way. So our job was focused specifically on the more than 150-year history of imposed residential schooling for Indigenous children in Canada. And our job, and if I may summarize it, threefold, was to gather together both oral and documentary evidence to and preserve that for all future posterity, to educate the people of Canada, and to inspire ongoing reconciliation. And there were a number of specific to-dos under each of those categories. But the first part of it really speaks to the truth-telling aspect of it. And if I were to, so I've zeroed in on 6 things that I want to highlight. I could say many things about our process, but I think are relevant to your questions. One, in our case, was the role of the courts. And that's important because, first of all, in Canada, Indigenous peoples have Section 35 protected constitutional rights, and that gave latitude to the court cases that came forward. And the courts concluded at the highest level, multiple court cases, but that there had been harm done and over multiple generations. So there was a recognition of harm as a starting point. So a truth commission wasn't something that was a political initiative. It was a court-ordered term of an out-of-court settlement, and it was an obligation. It was one, I think I have to say, that both the federal government and the 4 named national churches who ran residential schools, it was one that they entered into kind of begrudgingly. I say kind of, fairly, there was a lot of putting the brakes on throughout. But I think, to lead me to my next point, what became really important was the way in which we conducted our work. Because I think it would be fair to say that because of the tone and the attitude and the style, including inclusion, that we brought to our process, some of the resistance melted, not all of it. Nothing I say is absolute, but some of the resistance melted because people realized it wasn't going to be a big public shaming exercise. It was actually going to be a sincere invitation to learn the truth about ourselves, which most of us grew up not knowing and not being taught and knowing nothing about. And by the way, if it's not obvious, I want to be plain that of the 3 commissioners, I was the one non-Indigenous commissioner. So it was a mixed commission in that regard. And the parties to the settlement agreement were the federal government. They were the 4 named national churches, being Catholic and 3 Protestant denominations. But they were also the national Indigenous organizations. So we had the mix of diverse community there, even in the named parties to the settlement agreement. And part of what we did throughout our process is to make sure everybody stayed involved, that people didn't say, okay, there's the court thing, go do your thing, we're out of here. So we had also a strong bind on ourselves as commissioners that we would try to set the tone, that we would try to model the kind of reconciliation that we were calling the country to learn and practice. We were very intentional, thirdly, on the role and importance of inclusion. We had an aggressive outreach strategy, including something that we called honorary witnesses, that's reached out to Indigenous and non-Indigenous prominent members of society. And what we basically asked them to do is show up long enough, 1 minimum day, and listen to what residential school survivors have to teach us about their lived experiences as children. One of the important advantages we had is that there were still 80,000 living survivors at the time of settlement. And so we had a lot of people who had been waiting their entire lifetimes to get their throats unchoked and to be able to set down some of the burden that they've been carrying their whole lives, and for someone to listen and hear them and believe them. So we asked these honorary witnesses to come and listen. Then, as a result of that, to speak publicly in the moment at the end of that day to what they had heard and learned, and thirdly, to speak to what they personally would commit to do in their own spheres of influence, to spread the story, spread the awareness, spread the education as an ongoing challenge, and to, very importantly, inspire through their own actions, reconciliation as an ongoing, both individual and collective process. The role of ongoing education was also something we took to be both small e and capital E. We spoke in countless schools at the mostly secondary because of the subject matter, but at institutions across the country. But we also spoke to professional organizations, multiple levels of government, faith communities, sports communities, the media. We tried to educate by telling and educate by inviting and having people come and challenging them. We had an exercise called Expressions of Reconciliation, where we challenged not just in a general way, like contact um, big shot A, tell them about this event, tell them to come, and tell them what they would be willing publicly to commit to as an expression of reconciliation. And it was an action-based commitment. What would they do? So that led to things like pledges for curriculum change, pledges for documentary production, pledges for hiring challenges, all manner of things that I could go into in a lot of detail. We very intentionally throughout our work focused this as not being about government and what government had done wrong or what government needed to do better, because we knew that government by nature is fragile and fleeting and temporary and self-serving on its own timeline. That we needed the work to be long-term and sustained and sustaining. And so we put our calls to action, as we called them. We didn't want them to be recommendations that sounded fairly optional. We wanted them to sound urgent and compelling. We referred to them as calls to action, and we directed them across all sectors of society, knowing that very often the people are way ahead of the governments, and that there are good people willing to do great things, and willing to dream up all kinds of things that we didn't have time or capacity to think of or to name ourselves. One thing that's very important in our conclusion, and we had to accept this, is one size does not fit all. It never will, not in the aspect of truth telling, not in the aspect of what happened in school. What happened to this child may not be the same as what happened to that child. This child may have had a series of devastating experiences. This one may have been lonely and homesick, but got some good out of it. They don't cancel each other out. It's not a kind of zero-sum game. But what do we learn from those experiences? And what were things that made a positive difference? And sometimes it was as simple as the encouragement and of one good teacher who made a difference and changed a life. So we need to think about both what is the institutional power, but what is the power of one person and the personal care and behavior and support, sustained support of each and every one of us. Political response is hugely important because we engaged in the way we did, and partly because it was court ordered and the government was named as one of the defendants. We kept it in the political arena in terms of publicity. We invited prime ministers and premiers to all of our events. We knew that they too needed to be informed, and some of the most significant things were former prime ministers telling us, I knew about all these issues in my head, but only when I had an opportunity to listen and learn firsthand from the experience of somebody who was in those schools did I truly understand. And it speaks to what Anu was talking about the hearts and minds. It takes it from the mind to the heart and makes it a human experience and makes it a universal experience that people can get their minds and their hearts around. What if that had happened to me? What if that had been my child? How would I have responded? How would I have functioned as an adult? How would I have raised my children, having been raised that way as a child myself? And it raised a deeper, much deeper understanding of why the issue isn't over, why reconciliation is an ongoing challenge, why the intergenerational impact of the story is hugely important to understand, and not, okay, we've done this one thing and now we're done. DEI is not that. We call it EDI in Canada, but it's the same idea. And it is, I think the thing that I would like to say just in concluding this part, and there's much else, is that the word fragility has already been used in this call, and it is true. There is great fragility, but if we park it all at the base and at the feet of politicians, we are in a way making ourselves defeated when we have to, I think, find the high ground, stay on the high ground, call to the high ground, and invite others there. And part of the work is helping people who have been raised as strangers in our countries to become neighbors and friends to each other. And our institutions have segregated us, including our neighborhoods and our opportunities, in such ways that that's one of the challenging things is we're trying to make right with people that we have never got to know very well. So I think finding tangible ways to continue that work. And the final point that I want to make is this. The greatest, I think, gift we had in all of this, and it was the superpower that had nothing to do with us. It was just the blessed outcome was that by bringing people together, people realized on their own that this was not a punishment, that this was not an obligation, that this was not a to-do, that in fact it was an extraordinary enrichment, and that everybody benefited from it. And that, yes, not only were there new friends to be made, but also there was brilliance. There were new perspectives to enrich and deepen a conversation, not one being right or one being wrong, but as often is said in Canada, two-eyed seeing, that there is more than one way to see the world. And if we are humble enough to allow those multiple ways into our spheres of decision making, and if we are intentional about who's in the room when decisions are being made, then we can further the collective enterprise much more so. And I'll leave it at that. I have specific examples I could share if there's interest, but I'll leave it at that. And I think we live in a circle, so we must not allow ourselves to be discouraged by the state of the line. There are always going to be good people, whether it's us or those who come after us, and there are always going to be challenges, and we need to stay the course in knowing what's right and good and hold to that. And that's my own little conclusion on all that front.
Thank you so much, Marie. I am a super fan of your work, which seems like a weird thing to say. I want to start where you ended, which is at humility. And I really, you sort of got there at the end, but all throughout your comments, you seeded humility and empathy, and in everything that you said. And I liked how you started with there being a focus on process. And that's sort of a follow-up question that I have as we are sort of moving into the question and answer section. And so there's a Q&A. Please put your question in the Q&A. Also, if you're a panelist and you have a question for someone else, that sounds great to me. I know Erica and I have questions. So if we're moving forward with this focus on process, this intentionality, this invitation to show up and listen, this commitment to not just the global process, but showing up, being a model, doing this in your own space, and being an inspiration. Can you share about how we get started, right? What type of process do we get started with? And Marie, I'm looking at you because you know so much. But I guess this question is really for everyone. Where do we start with using the idea of transitional justice as a way forward in our country?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I know so much, but I know what we did. And I know those things that were both uplifting and that seemed to have a positive outcome. And I'll give you three examples. maybe 4 if I can talk fast enough. The first is at the very beginning of our work with the TRC. There was no roadmap for this. There's never been a TRC focused on long-term systemic harms to children, state-sponsored, not warfare consequences, state-sponsored harms to generations of children. And so there was no roadmap for our TRC. And one of the first things that I did in consultation with my commissioner colleagues, I reached out to a bunch of amazing, in my case, it happened to be a bunch of amazing women, multi-generational, that I knew who were all, they didn't know each other, but they were all movers and shakers in their respective fields. And I asked for what I called a women's engagement party. And I fed them and we had circle and we talked about the challenge and challenged everyone to be thinking about what might they do, what suggestions might they have, how might they help. And among other things, they all became super volunteers in the many, many, many over 300 community events that we had over the course of the years. Some of them actually went on to become honorary witnesses. But reach to who you know and don't start from the point of God, we got to figure out all the answers. No, I think call in all the people. I think that for me is always a go-to because I've never achieved a single great thing in my life on my own. The second example that I would give you is that it's yes, it's collective and it's long-term, but it's also hand-to-hand. I hate to use the word combat, but it's hand-to-hand outreach. I think a lot of people want to do the right thing and want to do a good thing and don't know what to do. And so it's like when I have a big family gathering, everyone shows up and they all say, "Can I help?" And I am very quick to say, "Yes, you do this, you do that, you do that." Like, I think if you can be specific with people and saying, "Well, here's a thing you can do." Example, our Minister of Education where I live, who happened also to be a residential school survivor. Well, what can I do? I said, well, you could rewrite curriculum. This could be the jurisdiction that sets the new high bar for the rest of the country and that is inspirational. Well, yeah, but I don't have any money to do that. And I said, I know government budgets well enough to know that somewhere in your budget, there's a line that says curriculum. All you have to do as the minister is to say, this year, instead of doing whatever it was we were planning to do, we're going to focus it on writing curriculum about residential school history, the treaties, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and we're going to make it mandatory for all children, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, as a condition of graduation. That's all you have to do, and then bring the right people together, educational experts and residential school survivors, and let them co-create that. And that's exactly what happened, and that became a bit of a thing across the country. And a third example I would give you, reaching out to some of the legal people in Alberta. So the judges, and I was sharing this with some of you the other day, decided that they wanted to do a specific action to encourage Indigenous lawyers who might be interested in the judiciary. And so they created a mentorship program, voluntary. They didn't want anybody being obliged to do if they didn't want to, but their hearts, people wanted to do something. So they said, okay, we'll do that. And this is what I meant when I was talking before about people realize that it is an enhancement. It is not an obligation, because what the judges reported back is that, in fact, they were learning as much or more from their Indigenous mentees as they were being able to offer them as the judge mentors. So it's just a fourth example I would give you: a royal ballet.
Sorry,
ballet.
can I add the other speakers just
Yes.
because we're running out of time? Sorry, Marie.
Okay. That's all right.
You know, how about others of you about where to start?
I can be quick. I think one, and Anu touched on it. I know Marie touched on it, and I think I see it in the Q&A, and it's kind of how we started here. Is you don't know there's a problem until you understand that there's a problem and it's been diagnosed. And so I think the first thing is education. You have to learn and know not only your personal history, because your identity grounds you in history, in your ancestry, in your own personal diversity. You know, I have white students who are like, you know, hey, I'm white. I'm like, yeah, but that's also the pervasiveness of white supremacy, because you're not white. You're of European descent. You might be German, you might be Irish. And every year that I have St. Patrick class on St. Patrick's Day, I always make the point of the connection between Puerto Rican and Irish independence. And the first Puerto Rican to graduate Harvard Law, Pedro Albizu Campos, who was an independent and hated U.S. colonist, with Iman de Valera, also at Harvard Law, who wrote the Irish Constitution. And if you don't know that your Puerto Rican and Irish independent freedom fighters have historical ties, then, you feel disconnected from these people and that you other people when you do that. And so the last thing I'll say is that, I teach the second week of Race and Foundations of American Law at Roger Williams, which is taught through a casebook that Nicole co-authored, and I wrote the first chapter on colonization and white supremacy in American law. And I can't tell you how many students end up enrolling in my federal Indian law class because they didn't know the history. I start that lecture with Supreme Court Justice Stanley Reed, who says every American schoolboy knows that we got this land from Indian savages because they traded it for trinkets and blankets. And that was in the 50s. And so I tell folks that he's not wrong. I went to public school and I was told my people were killed by Columbus. Yet I'm going home speaking languages that are not Puerto Rican, that are not Spanish, and so I think once you learn that, then it becomes, where Anu and Marie were talking about. Now, what do you do with that knowledge? I always get questions when I give these talks around colonization in the law and the history of white supremacy in the law. And the end, always at the end, is what can we do? And I said, at a minimum, you can steal my slide deck and give the presentation yourself, because I am not a gatekeeper. And if you call me and say, meet me on the corner of blah, 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 I will have my laptop and a microphone ready to give the presentation, because it's important we have the foundational knowledge. It's hard to act without the foundational knowledge. And so I just want to reiterate that point, because Marie had bulldozed through it in all her examples, but it was absolutely critical about that, which made all her work successful. And Anu, grounded us in that point as well, personal identity as well as, the history of the work you're involved in. So I just want to elevate those points.
All right, I'm going to jump in here because I think we can fold in the other two panelists in response to a question I'd like to pose that was provided to us by Professor Tiffany Atkins. And her question is tied to transitional justice. Transitional justice has historically been cabined within international human rights law as applying to nation states undergoing formal regime changes, usually from autocracy to democracy, allowing the United States to bypass accountability and the four pillars of transitional justice, hiding behind being a democratic state. Reconstruction and civil rights were transition points in U.S. history, but both projects remained abandoned or unfinished. And I think we heard that both from Dean Conway and Professor Palermo. So do you think, she asked, we are entering another transition point in the U.S. as we slide into an autocracy? Is it useful to identify transition points to deploy transitional justice mechanisms, truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition? And if so, what opportunities does this create for transitional justice in the US? So this is, I think, also still in the same way of answering what Marie and Ty have already spoken to, but perhaps one or either of you or both of you would care to expand on Professor Atkins's question.
I'll go and I'll be very brief. Absolutely. We're always in transition because of the fact that these acknowledgments have not been made, and because the project of Reconstruction was abandoned. And liminally speaking, the 19th Amendment abandoned women of color. Even though white women got the right to vote, there was a liminal abandonment of all others. And so we are constantly in transition, which frankly should be one of the things that we should actually promote in a democracy, that we are constantly willing to be in pursuit. That's in the Declaration, right? This pursuit. And so that pursuit is what makes us durable in this democracy. And so we must, and I love the context of speak up, speak out. That is the obligation of being a citizen. That is the obligation of being here. And education is a vehicle through which we can promote the meeting of that obligation.
Okay, thank you. Anu?
Yeah, I'll just add one comment. Thank you so much for that, Danielle. And I completely agree. Education is the vehicle for us to really begin this process. I also think about American history and cycles. So what we're experiencing right now is certainly a period of massive transition, but also a really important invitation and opportunity. If we think about where our country was 100 years ago, it was the height of the nativist movement, the xenophobic movement, um, lynchings of Black people in the 1920s, but it was also the time where the legal strategy to end Jim Crow, to end legal segregation, was beginning to be created and established. Similarly, 200 years ago, it was again height of slavery, but also where the abolition movement really began to take root. So if we look at it from that perspective, I think the invitation that this panel is offering and this work of transitional justice is offering is like we need to now repair the unfulfilled promises of the past now, from Reconstruction to now. And America has never lived up to the promises that it stands for, but I think it's an invitation and opportunity for us to be able to do that. And we can learn more from folks like Marie and our neighbors in Canada and South Africa on what that process could be like and how this process could be truly inclusive, moving to how we can really bring together the stories of the plurality that we actually are from all different racial backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. So, I think that's the invitation and the opportunity. What that movement looks like, I don't know. What is the thing we'll be doing this century? It's not as simple as ending legal segregation or slavery, but I think it has to be intersectional. It has to, I think our movements right now for human rights are too splintered across, immigration to climate to indigenous rights. So there's some sort of a cross section that we need to be working on. And I think it's really about educating ourselves about one another, coming closer. And through that process, I feel like the new movement will emerge.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn over to Nicole to take a couple of questions, perhaps from Professor Davis, but I also, Ty, want to take you up on that offer to meet on a street corner and steal your slides. Nicole, thank you.
Anu, while you were speaking, what was like sort of roaring in my head is what about us doesn't allow, what about these sort of American exceptionalism, the American story we tell ourselves, what is taught versus what should be taught, does not allow that sort of humility and that sort of listening, and what is it that we can sort of do about that? So thank you for sort of having so much insight. I'm going to ask the first question we got, which is what role in repair will play any entities, organizations, and individuals associated or at law schools and in law practice sending comments by April 13th, 2026 to the ABA Council on Legal Education and Mission on the proposed repeal of ABA Standard 206, diversity and inclusion. Does anyone want to jump on that?
So I will jump on that. I'm going back to the question just to see if I can get more of a handle on it. But yes, 206 is the standard with respect to using the principles of diversity that we broadly learned about through Professor Ty's exploration, and it relates to hiring and admission. And so the ABA Council has suspended 206, largely because of the conservative activism to shut it down, like we saw with the affirmative action case with SFFA. And so what we should do is be responsive to the ABA Council as individuals, as experts in higher education. We should make sure that people know the comment period and the hearing period is open, and that the ABA Council has set this comment and hearing period to be open for a good amount of time. So the point is to be responsive. The point is to provide a data-driven approach to those responses. And the point is, as we talked about in this webinar, stand up, right? We are educators. We know how to write. We know how to reason. We know how to advocate. And that's exactly what should be done. I hope I answered the question.
Did anyone else want to jump in on that, or I'll move on to the next question? My next question was, I know Danielle and Anu, you both touched on this about finding each other. And I think Marie also pointed out we are siloed based on our institutions, based on our geography, based on technology. So my question for everyone is, how do we find each other?
I'll start quickly, and that is a hard question. Everyone knows that we've been involved at Penn State Dickinson Law and the Anti-Racist Development Institute with the 10-volume book series, Building an Anti-Racist Law School, Legal Academy, and Legal Profession. And so this is a 10-volume book series. This has got 130 chapter contributors. It's got systems designers. It's got editors. And, you know, it was a groundswell. It was really quite a process of organic engagement. And sometimes that can work. But other times, I think we must be very strategic. We have to have these clearinghouses. We have to keep our ear to the ground and know what each other is doing. And then we have to see through coalition building how we can actually improve the work being done in one space or another space, and be willing to say, I'll prioritize or reprioritize my engagement to help this move forward, to help that move forward. And we have to, when we talked about humility, we have to have that kind of active humility to say, maybe it is time to prioritize or reprioritize so that we can build a stronger coalition. So keeping your ear to the ground, making sure you are aware and open and got your eyes open to see what people are doing. Ask questions, go to conferences, do these presentations, reach out and ask people, hey, do you know if something is going on?
I can add to that a little bit. I think there's, for me, the deep infection that we suffer from in the United States, which is not the case in places like South Africa or Australia or even Canada, where they can't deny the history, right? I think we've taken a drug of denial. And I think beneath the denial is just so much fear because the history of our country is just so violent. There's been just so much wrong, you know, and I don't know if any of the people who are watching have experienced this, but I've experienced it. When I first went to the South, I couldn't sleep for nights. I was in New Orleans, right by Congo Square. I literally saw that as a, you know, basically as a morgue of so many lives destroyed. So that's in the land. And I think part of how we find each other, to your question, is for us to really become aware of the stories we haven't been taught. And I think this is where the sciences can really help us. You know, all of us are human beings. We're 99.9% identical. There is no gene for race. And actually, people that are put in different racial categories are likely more similar genetically than people in the same racial category. Go figure. But this stuff is like, for a lot of people, it's explosive because they can't believe it because they've been taught so many lies. So I think for us, how do we find each other is for us to be those connectors. So we can actually correct misinformation. So we can actually bridge the information gap that is percolating. And with media, I mean, the amount of hate and rage that's spreading, I think part of it is we have to become the balm for our communities. And I think the way we have to do that is really through curiosity and compassion and care. I will say that where we did go wrong, particularly in the movement for DEI, was, you know, utilizing the instruments of shame, blame, and cancel. And they have been the Achilles heel for a lot of our work. We cannot cancel other human beings, regardless of how deplorable their views are, because we have to come from a place of, oh, we're not separate. We are completely interdependent. And if we can learn from the transitional justice process in South Africa, that was wholly dependent on the idea of Ubuntu. I am because you are because I am. So this idea of interdependence really is part of actually every indigenous tradition of our lands too. So it's really about bringing in the leaders from indigenous communities, from Black communities, from Asian American communities, from white ethnic communities and beyond to be part of this conversation. I think this is where there has to be some sort of a spiritual bridge for this work. And I know that was really important in South Africa, it was really important in Rwanda, it was important in Australia as well. So, but it has to be inclusive and holistic.
Thank you so much. Marie, did you want to add something?
Marie, you're on mute.
Yeah. Two people are controlling my mute, so I never know if I'm in charge of it or not. Sorry. I would just add a couple of things. I talked before about the kind of hand-to-hand outreach piece of it. I really feel that is important. And I think the other part of that is creating space. And it's one of the things particularly that all of you in academic institutions have. You have space. And that sounds like a straightforward thing, but lots of communities and communities within communities, space is a luxury. So how do you use that space and how do you let people know they're welcome into it? And I'll just give you an example, a recent example here where I was supporting a group of residential school survivors who want to establish a monument in our territory. But the outreach needs to be wider than just the very aging and health compromised survivor community. It needs to be wider. There was a gathering held, but it was literally those people who had received a phone call and a personal invitation, and please, will you come? And do you know about, oh, I didn't know about that. Yes, I would love to come. So I think at a micro level, to get things going, because then that starts to build momentum and they tell others, and that really, really helps. The other thing I would just say is we did all of our work with a standing advisory committee. We had an advisory committee of survivors who worked with us and walked with us throughout the whole journey. And that's something, I don't know if you have that practice in your jurisdictions, but sometimes that can be really helpful as well. That's not based on academic qualifications, but on experience qualifications, so that when we talk about truth, and who's referenced it several times, I completely agree. It's an experience. Truth has its own expertise. It is its own expertise, and it's so foundational. So that's another thing that we did that I think was really, really valuable.
Thank you. All right. We are nearly at time. Um, I really can't thank you all enough for being here, taking time, sharing wisdom. I also I want to thank Erica, my co-moderator, and the panelists, and especially Lisa. Lisa might have spoken the least today, but got us home. We got here because Lisa sent emails and reminded us and organized. And we also have somebody, Alex, who's behind the scenes on tech. Again, it is the people that you don't see. It is the admins for all of these people. It is my admin. It is all of the little things that got to today that I want to uplift. I want to uplift this community of people who came together and shared and agreed and disagreed and saw the hope in the future and saw the wreckage of the past, and what is worth all of this is repair or reconciliation, or in some cases conciliation, if we have not ever gotten to a moment of conciliation before. I want to make sure that you all pay attention to the things that were in the chat, specifically the last link that was sent, which was an invitation to join the TJ and USA network. You would reach out to Lisa. I also want to make sure that you are aware that This is just one part of a series. The other parts of the series are available online. This will also be available online. And for more information about the speakers series or to view past panels, visit the Transitional Justice in the USA project on the New England School of Law website. Thank you again to everyone, and we will see you in the next one of these in the series.